Because you think of the thousands of years that the indigenous people were here and all the different animals they shot with bows and arrows.
Across the world, there are tribes so isolated, so removed from modern life, that entire generations have lived with little or no contact with the outside world. Governments sent soldiers, researchers, and explorers to reach some of them, but in almost every case, they never came back. For those who did manage to make contact, what they discovered was extraordinary. Men painted ghost white dancing on sacred ground. Women asking to be whipped as part of a sacred ceremony. And tribes in South Sudan washing themselves in cow urine at sunrise. These are some of the most frightening and fascinating rituals on Earth that seem more like a scene from a horror film than real life. Let's get into it. Nasara Ritual. Vanuatu is a chain of volcanic islands scattered across the South Pacific Ocean, northeast of Australia. At first glance, the islands appear peaceful, but for generations, many of these communities remained so isolated that outsiders rarely entered their territory. And on some of these islands, there were places outsiders were never supposed to enter at all. These were sacred ceremonial grounds known as Nasara, spaces where some of the most important rituals in traditional Vanuatu society took place. The Nasara was more than a gathering place. It was where status was earned, where ancestral spirits were honored, and where a man's position within the community was judged publicly. Because of its importance, the ground itself was considered sacred. According to accounts recorded by researchers and local residents, village elders on certain islands once granted designated men the authority to kill anyone who entered these ceremonial spaces without permission. To understand why these ceremonies mattered so much, you first have to understand how power worked in parts of Vanuatu. A man could not simply inherit status from his father, he could not buy prestige. And he could not stand up one morning and declare himself important. He had to earn it, publicly. Across islands like Malekula and Ambrim, men advanced through what anthropologists call the grade-taking system. A long sequence of ranks, each one harder to reach than the last. Every promotion demanded proof of wealth, proof of endurance. Proof that the community recognized your authority. But there was another audience watching too, the dead. In traditional Vanuatu belief, ancestors are never truly gone. They remain close to the living world, influencing events and guiding the community. The higher a man climbed through the grades, the greater his standing became not only among the living, but among the ancestors as well. That is why these ceremonies could last for days. Entire villages gathered to witness them. Families spent years preparing for a single event. And much of that preparation revolved around one animal, the pig. Throughout many parts of Vanuatu, tusked pigs became one of the most important symbols of wealth and prestige. Their tusks continue growing throughout their lives, sometimes curling into complete circles that press back toward the animal's face. Raising one takes years, sometimes much longer. The most valuable pigs represent an enormous investment of time, labor, and resources, which is exactly why sacrificing them matters. The sacrifice proves that a man possesses enough wealth, support, and commitment to advance. The greater the sacrifice, the greater the status earned. On Malekula Island alone, researchers documented systems containing more than 20 separate grades, and every grade demanded more than the one before it. But the ritual is not only about status. It is also about the ancestors. That is where the white paint comes in. To an outsider, it might look decorative. Inside the ceremony, it means something very different. White is associated with the spirit world, with the ancestors, with the dead. When a man covers himself completely in white, he is not decorating his body. He is transforming it. The chants call to the ancestors, The stomping on the Nasara calls them closer. And for the duration of the ritual, the man becomes a vessel, a bridge between the living and the dead. Then comes the sacrifice. Rows of pigs are lined up publicly, and the masked men must kill them personally, one after another, without hesitation, without stopping. Anthropologists who witnessed these ceremonies described the atmosphere as overwhelming. Entire communities watch in total silence as men prove their spiritual and social worth. And when the ritual ends, the masks are burned immediately, because allowing them to remain risks leaving the spirit attached permanently. But maybe the strangest part of all is what is happening to the language itself. Vanuatu has one of the highest linguistic densities on Earth, over 100 distinct languages for a population smaller than many cities. Some villages now contain fewer than 200 fluent speakers of certain ceremonial languages. Researchers have documented ceremonies where younger participants continue chanting ancient phrases exactly as their ancestors did, while they don't even understand the words themselves. The ritual survives, even when the original meanings begin fading. And somehow, for the people performing them, that still does not make the ceremonies any less real. But Vanuatu was not the only place where tradition became a survival system. Thousands of miles away, deep inside the Amazon rainforest of Brazil, another indigenous community built an entire way of life around a ritual they believed was holding the world together. Yakwa ritual. In the 1970s, isolated indigenous communities deep in Brazil's Amazon rainforest experienced something catastrophic. The outside world arrived. Diseases came with it, and entire villages began disappearing. For communities that had lived in relative isolation for generations, illnesses like influenza and measles were devastating. Not because they were unusually deadly, but because the people encountering them had no immunity at all. Among the Anoini Nawi people near the Juruena River, the losses were horrific. Within only a few years of sustained outside contact, entire families disappeared. Some villages lost nearly a third of their population. And through all of that death, one ritual remained absolutely non-negotiable: the Yakwa. Because in Anoini Nawi belief, the Yakwa ritual is not symbolic. It is necessary. Without it, the world itself begins breaking apart. Every year during the rainy season, the community gathers near the river and constructs elaborate fishing dams entirely by hand. No modern machinery, no concrete, no industrial materials, just wood, woven barriers, funnels, and generations of accumulated ecological knowledge. The design is deceptively intelligent. Water flows naturally through the structures. Fish cannot. The trapped fish are collected, smoked carefully, and offered to spiritual entities called the Yakariti. Those spirits are not viewed as harmless guardians. They are dangerous beings that must be continuously fed and respected. In Anoini Nawi cosmology, this exchange maintains balance between the human world and the spiritual one. Then comes the most fascinating part. At the end of the season, the people dismantle the dams themselves. Deliberately. They destroy weeks of labor so the fish can migrate upstream and reproduce naturally. What looks like religion is also environmental management. What looks like mythology is also sustainability. The spiritual system and the ecological system became fused together so completely that separating them would damage both. And when outsiders interrupted those rituals during early missionary efforts, people drew conclusions quickly. The rituals stopped, and people died. From the perspective of the community, the connection seemed obvious. The spirits were no longer receiving what they were owed. Then, modern development arrived. Hydroelectric dam projects along the Juruena River disrupted fish migration patterns badly enough that some communities struggled to perform the yakwa at all. Fish populations collapsed in certain areas. River flow changed. Traditional fishing cycles stopped functioning the way they always had. The Anaweni Nawi went to court trying to stop some of the construction. In several cases, they lost. This created an impossible situation. A ritual designed to maintain balance with the natural world now existed in an environment outsiders had fundamentally altered. And suddenly, an entire spiritual system built over generations was being forced to survive inside conditions it was never meant to face. The bull jump. Before a Hamar boy in Ethiopia can become a man, the women in his family step forward first, and they ask to be whipped. That is the part most outsiders cannot understand. Nobody forces them. Nobody drags them forward. They request it publicly. The Hamar people of Ethiopia's Omo Valley built much of their social structure around cattle. Cattle determine wealth, marriage, status, and even inheritance. The ceremony that transitions a boy into adulthood is called the bull jump. But before the boy even approaches the cattle, his female relatives perform an act outsiders often mistake for abuse. Women line up carrying thin switches made from birch branches. Then men whip them across the back hard enough to leave permanent scars. The women sing while it happens. Sometimes they dance. Sometimes they encourage the men to strike harder, because within Hamar society, those scars represent loyalty. A scarred woman publicly stands beside her male relatives during major transitions. Her body becomes visible proof of commitment to family and community. Anthropologists working in the region found out that women viewed the scars with pride, not shame. The marks remain for life, and the community reads them almost like a social record written directly into the skin. Then comes the bull jump itself. Several cattle are lined up side by side. The young man must run across their backs repeatedly without falling. If he succeeds, he becomes eligible for marriage. He gains adult standing. He can own cattle. If he fails, the humiliation can follow him for years. Researchers documented cases where failed jumps destroyed marriage prospects completely. In some communities, failure carried such shame that young men isolated themselves afterward for months. But even among pastoral societies where cattle determine status, further west, in the grasslands of South Sudan, another community built an even deeper relationship with their herds. The name of the ox. Among the Mundari people of South Sudan, cattle are not property. They are identity itself. A Mundari boy eventually chooses a favorite ox from the family herd, and over time, that animal's name replaces his own. People stop calling him by the name he was born with. They call him by the name of the ox. That single relationship becomes central to his entire life. The Mundari sleep beside cattle. They sing to them, decorate them, and protect them. Photographers who spent time inside Mundari cattle camps described men sleeping only feet away from their favorite animals every night. Because losing cattle does not just mean economic collapse, it means social collapse. Without cattle, marriage becomes impossible. Families lose status, and a man can even lose his identity, which is tied directly to his ox. This explains why cattle raiding in South Sudan became so violent. Thousands die every year in conflicts connected directly to livestock theft. Entire armed groups organize around cattle raids. To outsiders, it can look irrational. But within Mundari society, cattle represent history, identity, ancestry, and survival all at once. Then there are the mourning rituals. Every sunrise, Mundari men burn dried cow dung and cover themselves in the ash. The ash protects against insects. It reflects sunlight, and it helps disinfect cuts. The Jengi spirit ritual. Deep inside the Congo Basin, the Baka people still move through the rainforest in ways outsiders barely understand. At dawn, before sunlight reaches the forest floor, voices begin rising through the trees. Layered singing, complex harmonies. No instruments, no conductor, just sound moving through the forest itself. Researchers studying Baka music discovered something fascinating. The singing often becomes more complex in unfamiliar or potentially dangerous situations. Because the music is not simply entertainment, it is communication, a signal telling everyone nearby exactly where the group is, a way of moving through dense rainforest without becoming separated, a declaration that they are traveling peacefully through the forest. For the Baka, the forest is not just a place, it is Jengi, a living presence that provides food, protection, and guidance, almost like a parent. Communities that once hunted, gathered, and moved freely through the rainforest found themselves restricted from lands their ancestors had known for centuries. And the forest was not the only thing colonialism and outside intervention tried to take from Central Africa. It also targeted marriage, wealth, identity, and the cultural systems that held entire communities together. Topoke iron currency. In the early 1900s, the Congo Free State became one of the most brutal colonial systems in recorded history. Entire villages were forced to meet rubber quotas imposed by Belgian authorities. Failure often meant mutilation, executions, hostages. Inside that system, communities like the Topoke still tried to preserve ordinary life. And one of the most important objects in that world was an iron spear. Not because it was a weapon, but because it functioned as currency. Topoke blacksmiths forged ceremonial iron spears that families exchanged during marriage negotiations. A marriage could require dozens of them. The iron itself was intentionally soft, too soft for combat, because the value was not in the weapon. It was in the labor required to create it. Making enough spears for marriage required family cooperation, time, resources, and community participation. Then, colonial authorities began confiscating them, because destroying those systems made communities easier to control. And while that destruction was happening, another process unfolded quietly in Europe. African masks and ritual art flooded into Paris through colonial trade routes. Artists like Picasso and Braque studied them intensely. Entire visual movements in modern Western art were influenced directly by African artistic traditions. But the communities whose creativity shaped those movements received almost no recognition. Survival through stories. Along parts of the Congo River system, there are bends in the water that local communities approach carefully. Not because of monsters or predators, but because people die there. Certain stretches contain submerged rocks, violent currents, methane gas pockets, or sudden underwater shifts capable of overturning boats without warning. Over generations, communities encoded those dangers into spiritual stories. Warnings became rituals. The river has already taken people. The ritual reminds everyone to respect that fact. Researchers studying Bantu River communities noticed something remarkable. Places marked as spiritually dangerous almost always corresponded directly with real environmental hazards. What outsiders often dismiss as superstition frequently contains generations of environmental logic compressed into a narrative. Because a story is easier to remember than an instruction manual, especially across centuries. And once you start seeing these beliefs as survival systems instead of superstition, the world begins looking very different. Almost every culture on Earth has rituals that look irrational from the outside. until you understand the problem they were originally trying to solve. Because long before written manuals, scientific journals, or formal education, human beings still needed ways to remember important information. So they turned knowledge into stories. They turned stories into beliefs. And they turned beliefs into rituals powerful enough to survive for generations. So, which of these traditions surprised you the most? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more stories like this. We'll see you in the next one.